Okay, we're ready to start. So we have here today Rebecca Roach, the University of Birmingham, and she's going to give a talk on conversation machines, missing secretaries, bot readers. This is like a story of conversational AI agents, something like that. So we're ready to start, and Rebecca, we're looking forward.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, that's okay. Thank you for having me. This is going to be pretty informal. I'm just going to talk to some slides. So if anyone has any questions or things they want clarifying, please do shout or wave on Zoom. Yeah, so I'm really happy to be here. This is sort of an ideas paper, I guess, in that I'm going to spend a little bit of time outlining the background to this this bigger project, and then I'm going to kind of zoom in on one particular case study, which in the eventual book forms a chapter. But in order to kind of understand the context and what's going on and why I'm examining things in the way I am, it's helpful to have the sort of broader stakes and arguments at play. This is not necessarily a, this is an interdisciplinary beast, I should say, in that I'm a literary scholar originally. When I originally conceived of this project, it was largely about the relationship between literature and computing historically. And I got myself a Leverhulme grant to finish it last year, and then about halfway through last year I realized it was two different books. And so I kind of scooped out quite a lot of the literary material, which is talking about how writers engaged with computers and computing technologies historically to understand their literary projects. And it was a bunch of different writers from an Anglophone tradition who were also had quite a lot of engagement with the teaching of literature at a university level. So I was also really interested in kind of institutions and the legacy of that bifurcation is still quite visible in this, but I'm hoping that it sort of forms a coherent project. But you know, as with literature, as with research, it's the fun of finding things out. So as background, the project is sort of generally called Machine Talk. It starts from the premise of the fact that historically our understanding of computers, one of the significant metaphors of that is the giant brain, so the thinking machine. That's one of the central historical metaphors for understanding what a computer might be. So we've got a lovely picture of Ed Barkley, I never know how to pronounce his name, let's go with Berkeley because he's American, who was he was big in popularizing computing in the very early period. He's sort of the equivalent to Norbert Wiener, but he helped set up the Association for Computer Machinery. He he wrote Giant Brains or Machines That Think, which was a kind of a key text in popularizing ideas around computing in the 1950s. And this is also Squee down below, which is an electronic squirrel. He created a lot of different kind of electronics kits to sort of get kids and popular interest in early computers and robots. And he really was the sort of guy behind the giant brains metaphor that was so significant and really, I guess, shaped the way that we understand computing today. Artificial intelligence, the focus on intelligence there is so common a metaphor that we don't really even think about it. But so really the sort of starting point was, yes, machines that think, or thinking machines, was a powerful conceptual model for thinking about computers, and so powerful that we've perhaps forgotten a little bit about it. But actually, there was another one. So the premise for my book. Sorry, I should have just said, it also stems from this sort of cybernetics in the 1940s and 50s, their work around brain functions and neural networks, and that fed into early computer innovations. And so there really was quite a strong link between brains and with this idea of brains and thinking and computers. But and a lot of work has been done on that topic. It's a relatively well-told story in the history of computing. And it's sort of, I'm actually just going to skip over that. There's another one. There's another metaphor is really sort of the point I'm trying to make, which is computers as talking machines. And it's a metaphor that if we start to think about it a little bit, I think is really valuable. It starts to help us, I think, to kind of historicize and contextualize a lot of our emphasis on conversational interfaces today, the chat of ChatGPT, for example. And I think it's also helpful to kind of lean into this particular metaphor or model and look at the story of the development of that metaphor historically, for how it might ask us to rethink what a computer is, how it functions, how we interact with it, and the difference between talk or conversation and thinking. So a thinking machine versus a talking machine, how that might encourage us to think about sort of different histories of computing, different kind of influences and intellectual kind of constellations in the history of computing that we might have sort of left out. So the book itself is trying to tell the story of this sort of history of talking machines. So less giant electric brains, more giant electric vocal cords or larynxes. Obviously, this is not a new metaphor. It is as much sort of central to the history of computing as the as the thinking machine and the brain metaphor. The Turing test, so-called, is the sort of classic example of this, which is, for those of you who don't know it, was a 1950 paper that Alan Turing, computer pioneer, promoted, which was it took up a parlor game from the 1890s, whereby a person has to guess, in this instance, whether they are conversing with a computer or a person. And they have to use their interactions to kind of make an evaluation. And Turing's sort of argument is that we can say that machines can think if they can pass this test. So his conception of machine intelligence is also one that's highly reliant on an understanding of conversation and an ability to talk. And so that's sort of one of the starting points for sort of thinking about this. So I want to zoom in on a particular moment in this history. There are various other ones I could talk about. So it might sound that like this is kind of an esoteric example, but just before I kind of zoom in, just to say that this metaphor is actually a really generative one. If you just look at kind of mainstream histories of computers, you can start to kind of pick this out. So the phenomenon of conversational computing was a really significant way of understanding computers from about the late 1960s all the way through to the 1980s, to basically the moment just before the World Wide Web. And I think there's something really interesting in the fact that we have so adopted the language of the net, the web, that we have forgotten that actually there was this older model, this phenomenon called conversational computing, that was used to both describe kind of time sharing and early network computing. It was also used to describe programming languages. So BASIC was considered, for example, to be a conversational programming style. And it relied on an idea of kind of slightly more interaction in the relationship between the programmer and the machine, and a kind of timeliness. So we're sort of moving away from linear programming models into time sharing and multi-processing. And conversational computing as an idea really starts to sort of take off in the late 1960s. I'm looking here at a slightly earlier moment and a more visible example of what we might think of as a talking machine. So there's this broader phenomenon of conversational computing, and then we can also think about conversational machines. Project Mac, which was MIT, sort of 20 years, it housed both the AI project at MIT and also a kind of more general focus on time sharing's potential in the 1960s. And the goal of Project Mac overall was, and I put the quote on the board here, which is just an intimate collaboration between man and computer system in the form of real-time dialogue. And again, you see this, this use of metaphors of conversation, of dialogue, and the kind of intimacy, a sort of effective relationship that this might create between human and computer. So in the sort of earliest thinking around human-computer interaction, there's this emphasis on dialogue and on conversation. And we can link that to the fact that programming has, by this point in the 1960s, been understood to be a linguistic activity. You know, that wasn't necessarily a given in the in the late 1940s and 50s. There's actually a conceptual move whereby we start to think about calculations that are required to program a computer being understood as a linguistic activity. And I think that's an important kind of precursor to this notion of dialogic interaction. Anyway, Tech Square at Project Mac was the site, the MIT site. There's a nice picture there of this model of these investigations into time sharing's capability, and it's also the site of the example I'm going to talk about in a moment. It's not that I'm saying that there wasn't the I should sort of a caveat. I'm not saying that the model of the thinking machine or the electronic brain wasn't circulating in this moment, in this particular environment. It very much was. It's just that I'm just interested in kind of excavating this alternative way of thinking about things to sort of think about how it might reshape our understanding of tech development. Just as a little bit of background, one of the reasons I kind of came at this project and this interest in machine talk was how operative a metaphor it seemed to be in both cultural contexts at this time, educational contexts, and also computational or kind of technological discussions as well. And particularly in the 1950s and also at MIT, we have this conversation starts to take on really high stakes in these environments. In the 1950s, this is a faculty survey from MIT. What I just really liked about it is that it has conversation kind of pulled out as a specific activity. So we have teaching, we have thesis advising, we have research and writing, study, correspondence, and then we have conversation. And just that little line started getting me thinking about what kind of work do we think that conversation is doing? What do the people who are about to go and build these question-answer machines, these programs to basically enable man-machine, and I'm using man deliberately, man-machine interfaces, what kind of understanding are the people who are building these? What kind of understanding of conversation do they have? What do they think it does? So that was sort of the starting point when I was in the MIT's archives last summer. And from my own kind of background as a literary scholar, I I was really conscious of how conversation becomes heavily tied to discussions around the value of liberal humanities education in this period. I won't go into these quotes, but basically Robert Hutchins, who was president of University of Chicago just before the war, and then he took over, he jumped over to the Ford Foundation, which was hugely significant funder of various programs and research, including international computing in the post-war period. But he was kind of a zealot in promoting the idea of the Great Conversation. And this was a model of understanding that we can certainly contest today, that was really thinking about, was really making the argument that the Great Conversation was this series of debates in across Western civilization over 2,000 years, and in order to become a citizen, a participating citizen in a democracy, what we need to do is to teach our students, our young people, this Great Conversation, so this series of books. But this metaphor becomes, and this sort of program of the Great Conversation is rolled out in huge schemes. It was referred to as the kind of Manhattan Project of the Humanities by one scholar, which I think is quite a useful, it's useful for gesturing to the perception of the stakes. This is an era of, Cold War in which, it's the cultural Cold War. It's really this notion that, the way in which to stop communism is to make sure that all of our students are well read in Great Conversation. So my point really is that there are these huge claims about what liberal humanities and the kind of humanities syllabus might be able to do. But basically, there's going to be the fall of humanities. There's going to be the fall of humanity without a Great Conversation, and that by talking to each other, we're going to solve all issues and ensure world peace. I'm slightly overdoing it, but not by much. And so I was really struck by how, what does this larger background mean at MIT, where conversation is starting to be built, programmed, and modeled. This is obviously a campus that is dedicated to science and technology. It is not a liberal arts college, but there's clearly some sort of interest in these ideas. It's in the air, and so I was sort of really interested in sort of pursuing this. It's also, and I won't delve into this, but just to say it's a metaphor that has continued to the point at which I'm not sure that the humanities writ large is very good at noticing how common a metaphor it has become for understanding what the activities or the kind of point of the humanities and the arts are. It kind of becomes a sort of an anti or an absent method, in the idea that if we just have conversations across cultures or across disciplines, we don't, that will solve everything. So this is both at the level of kind of Richard Rorty's conversational philosophy. It's also at the level, right down at the level of the practical academic writing. Two of the most popular academic writing books in the US focus very heavily on this notion of writing as a conversation, and extending that out to be, if you write, if you can kind of engage in a conversation through your writing, you can be a good citizen. So that logic of the reason we teach the humanities is because they can help develop citizens is one that's still with us today in ways that we haven't necessarily understood. Or sort of, we often use it as a lazy metaphor, myself included. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have conversations. But the other point I would just make is that, conversation, we can also think of it as a technology. We can think of conversation as, it is often used as a kind of interface for man-machine interaction. It's become a very common one. but I think it is helpful to understand conversation itself as technology with certain affordances, and I think that might help us to think about some of the difficulties and problems, but also opportunities inherent within this history of talking machines. A little bit of a segue here, but I was reading the news yesterday, and two stories kind of popped up on The Guardian. There we go, I've admitted what I was reading. One of them was the Alabama Supreme Court has just granted status, personhood to embryos to frozen embryos. So the Alabama Supreme Court has said that to damage an embryo comes under the remit of their law around child death. And then on the other hand, there was a story about Air Canada having made the argument, not successfully, but made an argument in court that a chatbot on their website was a separate legal entity, and therefore they didn't have any legal responsibility for the information the chatbot had provided to a customer. And the thing that struck me about those two stories sitting there is that I think what I'm about to show is the stakes are still very much here in terms of how the role of women's bodies in production, in the case of babies, has sort of been is being legally eschewed. But yet there are also these moves to make chatbots, to grant chatbots kind of legal subjecthood. And those two kind of parallel moves, I think, are more implicated than we might think. And so I don't have grand thoughts on that yet, but I'm just aware of it. Anyway, no surprises. My example is Eliza. So Eliza is perhaps the most famous chatbot talking machine, if we will. It was built by Joe Weizenbaum, who is at MIT. He joined in 1964, and he developed it as part of the time sharing system at MIT. There's a nice picture on the left of Maurice Wilkes, who was actually at the math lab at the other Cambridge, using his home study teleconnection to the MIT lab. So Joe was fully enmeshed in this in Project Mac, along with another 400 people, but he's often credited with having kind of built the first general conversation machine, and by that I mean sort of not domain specific and not a question answerer, which was what a lot of the programs were doing in the kind of early 1960s. He was working on it and published it just as My Fair Lady was coming out, the musical, and a lot has been written, understandably so, on Eliza and the problematic kind of gendered assumptions around artificial eaves is the term one scholar uses, and the kind of long history of figuring tech in a gendered manner. And UNESCO wrote a report in 2019 that was talking about that kind of really current problems with gendering Alexa, for example, and the sort of assumptions around service and the kinds of labor that are assumed around that. But I actually don't want to talk much about Eliza, the program itself. I want to talk about the user. So in a lot of the work on Eliza, as I said, there's been this long discussion about, and sorry, I should have said, for those of you who aren't aware, Eliza is a chatbot whereby it's a program that basically takes you as the user, you type in a problem comes up, you type in a response, and it's modeled on the idea of a kind of psychiatrist. So it'll say, hi, I'm Eliza, what's your problems? What's your problem? And you can kind of type, and then the program will pick up some key prompts and kind of spin it back in a script to you. So it gives an illusion of general comprehension and understanding. It was hugely popular when it came out, and Playboy covered it, and everyone was very excited about the possibilities that this talking machine seemed to augur. However, I don't want to talk about Eliza. As I said, I actually want to talk about the user. One of the things that I find particularly striking about the whole discussion around Eliza is Joe Weizenbaum talks again and again and again about his secretary and how the thing that concerned him most about, so Joe goes through this period of sort of enlightenment, as he sees it, this journey whereby he builds this, and then he is horrified by how people respond to it. They treat it like a real person, and he's horrified for what this means for humanity. As a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany, certainly there are many ways in which we can see him kind of grappling with these questions around how to create, thinking about the kind of role of technology in society and kind of ethical responses to it. And his takeaway from the Eliza episode is him watching his secretary engage with the machine, and as this quote says, she turns to him and says, can you leave the room, please? And he sees this as horrifying instance of kind of computer trickery and the failure of users to understand what is going on. And he kind of writes this big book called Computer Power and Human Reason 10 years later, that sort of just takes the artificial intelligentsia to task, and he is somewhat exiled from the community as a result of this. But it was a very big, popular book, and it to some extent really shaped the way in which AI was understood in that moment. But what I find so fascinating about this is that it turns on this user that he depicts again and again across his publications, this secretary, and the degree to which the way in which he is depicting the secretary feeds into a much longer tradition around bad readers. That if you're a book historian or a literary scholar will no doubt be familiar around kind of 19th century readers of novels, and they're always women. We could take it back as far as the kind of laity with Gutenberg's Bible, or we could look at modernist interwar period and the kind of modernist high art versus the kind of female masses division. This is a long-standing kind of trope around stereotypical bad readers who can't be trusted, who are also heavily gendered. And it also, to some extent, kind of sets my hackles going, because she's never named. The secretary is always this unnamed secretary. So Eliza, if you think about the disparity for a moment there, you have Eliza named, very, very famous chatbot piece of technology, but the actual users who are shaping interpretations in this case just have not been written out of the account, but their identity and their particular interpretive strategies or engagements have been written out of the account. One of the things looking at this is when he says, sorry, I can't see because I'm sorry. Here we go. So, would you mind leaving the room, please? I believe this anecdote testifies to the success with which the program maintains the illusion of understanding. Well, I'm not sure it does, actually. What he has inferred something there, but there are multiple reasons why she might not like to be observed talking to this machine, which might have very little to do with her, with her desire to, to read badly or not the computer program. It might be that she, doesn't want a man, her boss, someone in a figure of authority breathing down her neck. It might be that he, is making her uncomfortable. There are many, many reasons of which I can't possibly know, but he has, he allied that particular reading that he is doing from this account in order to basically insist on it. And he does this over and over again. So I just the thing that sort of strikes me is how much literary analysis and tradition might actually help us to rethink what is going on in this foundational moment in the history of talking machines. I'm gonna have to move this back again. Sorry about this, everyone. The other thing that I found really interesting, so I went to, as I mentioned, I went to the archives of Joseph Weisselfeld's archives are held at MIT. And I scoured the archives desperately trying to find out who his secretary was. So I can't tell you if this is an amalgamation of administrative support assistants, if it is one figure, if it was a personal secretary, or one affiliated with Project Mac or the Department for Electrical Engineering where he worked, because MIT and Joe basically don't keep records of administrative support. So I think there's another interesting argument, which I won't expand here, but just around transcription processes and the degree to which women Kittler's talked about, Friedrich Kittler's talked about this, but the sort of degree to which female transcribers get, there's a real gendering going on around technological practices and inscription practices historically, and the degree to which women are seen to be these invisible mediators. And you can actually see this going on in MIT, whereby they just don't keep records of who was doing this administrative support. MIT also had a real women problem at this point, particularly in the computer science department. There are many reports at the time about this, but the other thing I noticed in the archive, and that's just the thing I really want to focus in on here, is the sort of edging towards a conclusion, is that if you actually look at the status of the transcripts in the archive, Joe's editing them. So I've got an example here on the left, and actually what you see is he's not, these are examples, they're very small edits, they're kind of boring actually in some respects. So he changes, for example, a reference to the psychiatrist to a reference to an expert. He's editing both the prompts and the responses. And what I find so fascinating here is he's not reprogramming, he's not writing code here. This isn't the example that is on the right. This is a transcript that's the kind of product of that talking machine interaction. And so it really starts to ask some questions around what Joe understands the status of the transcript to be. What kind of data can conversation be? And the kind of answer I come to here is he's really treating it as an aesthetic object, as an editable text. And so there seems to be a kind of, if I'm thinking about this from a literary perspective, there's an interesting instance here whereby the possibilities and the expertise that literary expertise might be said to possess have been elided from the domain of the talking machine very, very early. So even though there's this long tradition around the talking machine, around conversation, which the talking machine is to some extent tapping into, around we can solve all problems if we have a universal language for programming, if we do machine translation, if we create talking machines. It's tapping into that tradition around the stakes of culture and the world. But the methods and expertise that are associated with that domain have been deemed at this sort of pivotal moment to be irrelevant to the study of talking machines. So I think there's a really interesting reading that we can do of this transcript. He's also, as I said, making it more boring. He's moving this transcript towards a more stereotypical, archetypal reading. He's taking out references to the police, and he's turning it into more a relationship with one's father or something. So this I find kind of fascinating. As I mentioned, I've kind of gone out of order here, but he picks this up again in his book, Computer Power and Human Reason. And one of the more famous responses to that is by John McCarthy, who a big dude in AI, and he has a review called An Unreasonable Book. In that review, he is really playing, I think, with different understandings of kind of reason. So that notion of a kind of more humanistic understanding of sort of 18th century reason. He's playing with the sort of notion of a kind of computational binary logic, but he's also playing with notions of kind of reasonable interpretation as well. So I think there's a way in which the debate around computer power and human reason is also a debate about the sort of status of Joe's literary, critical, analytical abilities as well. So it's something that I think kind of continues, but something that we might want to just look a little bit more at, I guess. Significantly, as I mentioned, and that's what I'll end it, just that we're living with the descendants of Eliza today, even if the technology that was, even if the coding in Eliza wasn't perhaps the most riveting in the world, that to me that's less the point than the way in which it co-opted certain narratives and sort of has really sort of set our expectations and understandings of the relationship between gender, technology, conversation, and what that might mean. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And so let me stop the recording.